religious and spiritual rituals. In modern culture, the spiritual use of cannabis has been spread by the disciples of the Rastafari movement, who use cannabis as a sacrament and as an aid to meditation. Also, we cannot forget about hemp, or industrial hemp. It's a botanical class of cannabis sativa cultivars grown specifically for industrial or medicinal use. It can be used to make a wide range of products along with bamboo. Hemp is among the fastest growing plants on earth. It is also one of the first plants to be spun into usable fiber more than 50,000 years ago. It can be refined into a variety of commercial items, including paper, rope, textiles, clothing, biodegradable plastics, paint, insulation, biofuel, food, and animal feed. Of course, just a few of the many products that can be created or produced with hemp. Of course, the industrialized version of cannabis, and as we are here, of course, to see how we can further develop the production and processing of cannabis on island to improve not only the economy of Dominica, but the region as well. So if you're just tuning in, we're here to bring you live coverage of the Cannabis Symposium with a theme from traditional cultivation to commercialization of cannabis. And we're just about ready to get started with Mr. Adisa Trotter. And this morning's symposium is organized by the Rastafari Ainati Waitakubuli Multipurpose Cooperative Societies Limited through the House of Nyabinghi Waitakubuli in collaboration with the UE Open Campus Dominica. So today's chairpersons will be Mr. Adisa Trotter, Agricultural Officer, Minister in the Ministry of Agriculture and member of the Rastafari Cooperative, and Ms. Athleen Nesty, Attorney at Law, Registrar, Acting, Companies and Intellectual Properties Commission. We already had the planting of the cannabis trees, and now we'll have the opening.
From traditional cultivation to commercialization of cannabis. We will call a member of the House to bless up the ceremony.
And now we'll have the opening chant done by the House of Nyabinghi.
Greetings, one and one. Aliyah, Selassie, the first Rastafari. Aliyah, Selassie, the first Rastafari. Aliyah, Selassie, the first Rastafari. In the words of His Majesty, we come here together to assert our rule to the direction of world affairs and to discharge our duty as our people to the great continent and the great country whose hundreds of people we now serve. Waitakubuli today, at mid-course, is in transition from the Waitakubuli of yesterday to the Waitakubuli of tomorrow. Even as we stand here right here in UE, with the historical gesture where you just see the plant the tree, we're in an island that was illegal. Now we can have free trees in the top university in the island. We move from the past into the future. The task on which we have embarked and the making of this new Waitakubuli, this new era of a generation that bring the consciousness of our peoples forward from the ancestors who suffered in the hills, virgin and sisterin, who paid with their lives for this plant, this innocent plant that, as Rastafari, we've been for years calling for its sacramental and respect. We must act to shape and mold the future and to leave our imprints on the events as they slip into history. We seek at this gathering to determine whether we are going and to chart the course forward of our destiny. It is not less important that we know whence we came. An awareness of our past is essential to the establishment of a personality and our identity as White Kubuli and as Africans. Haile Selassie I, the first Rastafari. Gloriful in words, gloriful in sounds, and powers of the Almighty I. A pleasant day to all, and guidance.
Okay, today with me is Miss Aflin Nesty. We are sharing together. So I will now pass on the mic to Miss Nesty.
Good morning, everybody. And for our listening public, my co-host is Mr. Adisa Trotter. He's an agricultural officer and from the Ministry of Agriculture and a member of the Rastafari Cooperative. As mentioned before, my name is Aflin Nesty. I'm an attorney at law and the Registrar of Companies and Intellectual Property. Thank you. Again, good morning, everybody. We'd like to welcome
Professor Rosemary Bell Antwine, who is the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal Designate of UWI in St. Augustine. Chairpersons, Ms. Aflin Nesty, who is the Registrar of Companies and Intellectual Properties, as well as an attorney at law in Dominica. Mr. Adisa Trotter, who is an agricultural officer, as well as a member of the Rastafari Cooperative. Members of the House of Nyabinghi and members of the Rastafari Cooperative, our symposium presenters, some of them are here with us in the auditorium, and some of them are joining us online. Members of staff of UWI Open Campus Dominica, I have Lisa and Kidisha and Clarissa and Barry in here with me, and the others are throughout the grounds. I also have Lincoln here too, and the others are throughout the grounds. Good morning also to the media houses present, to our audience members, both those with us inside the auditorium as well as those who are listening live on DBS or are following us online through Imo News and DBS's live stream. Good morning to everyone. Good morning to everyone. Okay. Today, I am elated to welcome all of you to the Cannabis Symposium presented by Rastafari Ainiti Waitukubuli Multipurpose Cooperative Societies League, or also affectionately called the Rastafari Cooperative, and the UWI Open Campus, as part of Africa Week celebrations in Dominica. Our participation in this symposium forms part of UWI Open Campus's commitment to providing opportunities for non-formal education for our people. For many years, the House of Nyabinghi has been one of our favorite collaborators on events and activities, and we have hosted several public lectures, fora, and symposia together. It is a relationship that was started by our current principal, Dr. Francis Sevre, during his time as head here in Dominica, and he was adamant that our commitment to this relationship should continue. So I am indeed pleased that we are able to work with the House on yet another venture. Today's symposium, which is entitled From Traditional Cultivation to Commercialization of Cannabis, Through it, we are aiming to move from where we left off a few years ago when Dr. Marshall Emanuel, who's with us again today, last visited us with Dr. Andre Horton. No longer is the focus strictly on education, on the benefits of cannabis and the need for legalization. Instead, today, as the global trend has evolved and the COVID pandemic has brought already struggling economic activities to their knees, we have to see cannabis for what it really can do, and it is time for us to demystify it and look for avenues of commercialization. Our symposium today began with the planting of the cannabis seedling on the grounds of UWI Open Campus. Like Equatorial, which was abused and shunned for many years because we did not yet know better and had not yet awoken ourselves, the planting of our seedlings today are a demonstration that our site in Dominica is ready to embrace our traditions as part of who we are and the potential that we have within us. Both Equatorial and cannabis, we can see that people were once severely beaten and dehumanized for those. And what was once to be done in secret, in both cases, actuellement, ça c'est law puyo. And all my Rastafarian brothers and sisters can say, oh, okay then, all right. We will continue with the presentation from Dr. Marshall Emanuel and Professor Belle Antoine, who will examine from traditional cultivation to explore future prospects for cannabis. Ms. Roseanne Charles, Mr. Midian Larrock, and Mara Abraham will examine our current situation in Dominica from the legal and Bureau of Standards perspective, respectively, as a way of showing us where we are and what we need to do in order to move forward. Mr. Algernon Roberts, Mr. Levon Flynn, and Mr. Spirit Cottle, our colleagues from regional licensing authorities, will share best practices and ideas on how we in Dominica can set up our own licensing authority. In addition, Dr. Martha Augustus and our health officials will present on the medicinal advantage of cannabis. Finally, Dr. Anne-Marie Okazimi will host the working session as we plan for the future. It is a packed schedule, I know, yet we are sure that there is much that we can learn and share throughout the symposium. I thank the Office of the Prime Minister and Meta Trackers who are co-sponsors of this event. We are grateful for Multi Solutions, DBS, and Imo News who have been gracious to carry our events live. I wish success to this event, and I trust that we will have lively discussions throughout. All my best to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joseph, for such a wonderful welcome. And we adopt your words and your point of view, and we recognize that we're moving from traditional to a modern approach. We're moving from traditional cannabis to the intention of using cannabis for profitable means and in being engaged in commerce. This theme today renders an insightful, growing, modern, and somewhat challenging but necessary approach to the use of cannabis. Bob Marley once said that cannabis is the healing of the nation. Well, commercialization in itself will in fact add to such healing of a nation. And so we are happy now to introduce our next distinguished guest, Dr. Marshall Emanuel, who will talk to us on traditional cultivation to commercialization of cannabis sativa. Dr. Marshall Emanuel is a lecturer in the Department of Life Sciences at the University of the West Indies, Mona Campus, Jamaica. He holds a bachelor's in zoology and botany, and a master's in plant production and protection, and a doctorate in botany from UWIC Mona Campus, Jamaica. One area of his research is crop science, with a focus on post-harvest of fresh tropical and subtropical fruits and vegetables. Dr. Emanuel is also the principal investigator of Life Science Cannabis Research Group in the Department of Life Sciences, UWI Mona campus. His research team conducts research in the area of tropical horticulture for cannabis sativa, its application, consistency, efficacy, and quality control throughout the cannabis value chain. He's the Vice Chair of the Bureau of Standards of Jamaica Cannabis Technical Committee for the development of standards for the Jamaica cannabis industry. He is also a technical member of the Ministry of Industry and Commerce's Cannabis Task Force and chairman of the Product Development Subcommittee. It's not here, but he's also Dominican, and I think it's time that he comes back home. Without further ado, we welcome Dr. Emanuel.
Okay, greetings everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here today. Excuse? And you're telling me that now? I only see it. Hold on, there's a little technical difficulty. Let me just rectify this situation.
Tuned in to live coverage of the Cannabis Symposium from traditional cultivation to commercialization of cannabis. Of course, that's being hosted here at the auditorium of the UWI Open Campus. We already had the opening chant done by the House of Nyabinghi. We also had welcome remarks from Dr. Kimon Joseph, head of UWI Open Campus Dominica. We also had opening remarks from the chairpersons of the symposium, that's Mr. Adisa Trotter and Ms. Atheline Nesty. And now we are awaiting the beginning of the first breakdown, traditional cultivation to commercialization of cannabis sativa. That will be done by Dr. Marshall Emanuel. At the moment, they're just working through some technical difficulties.
Address these logistical issues with the presentation. We want to give some brief remarks with respect to this symposium in terms of the importance of having it, why we should all consider the importance of looking at the cannabis industry for Dominica and have our minds open, and we can sort of, suggest ways that we see fit in addressing the cannabis industry for Dominica. Because most of us in here, I believe, are following what's happening in the cannabis industry on a global level, and we see a lot of strides being made. So here in Dominica, I think we have the opportunity to come up with something unique, and it will be an advantage for each and every one on island. So I want us to, relax and have that open mind, and let's look and see how we can best approach the cannabis industry. So Dr. Emanuel will now do his presentation.
All right, my apologies for technical difficulty. It should be rectified very soon. And thank you for such warm introductions. And it's always a pleasure to be within my and sharing my knowledge with other Dominican population. So I would like to special greetings to Dr. Joseph, principal of the UWI Open Campus, or head. All right, apologies. Professor Belantwine, designated principal for St. Augustine Campus, members of the Dominica government, members of the Rastafari community, welcome. So today, my presentation is going to focus on the traditional cultivation to the commercialization of cannabis. As you know, cannabis is an interdisciplinary approach, particularly towards legalization. as you know, there must be aspects of the legal aspect, social aspect, science, and so forth taking place to all come together to actually promulgate proper regulations that will be able to facilitate economic commerce. So my presentation today is going to focus more on the plant itself and how are we able to exploit the plant from the knowledge that we have traditionally to understanding economic gains from cultivating this horticultural commodity. So cannabis, for a single species of plant, contributes to human well-being in a very significant way, from structural, from hempcrete, from medically, to nutritionally, to spiritually, and the list goes on. So just within my introduction, cannabis is possibly cultivated today on every continent globally. The challenge would be in Antarctica. How is that possible? But there is possibly some scientists growing cannabis in a tent somewhere on that continent. So we understand the level of intrinsic relationship that cannabis provides to human well-being in such a significant way. So in introducing the plant, cannabis is an annual dioecious flowering plant. It produces male and female flowers. It is wind-pollinated, as you see. It does not have any pretty petals to attract pollinators, but the plant is physiologically designed to attract pollen within the wind to its sticky pistils. Cannabis produces the phytochemicals known as cannabinoids, and these are produced by the glandular trichomes. Does this pointer work? Oh, sorry. Right, so if you see, so the trichome glands are everything that we exploit the plant for medically. If you know, the Cannabaceae family also has a sister genus known as hops, and hops is used to make beer, and it's the same trichome glands from hops which is exploited for commercial production in beer production. So archaeological evidence has definitely showed significantly that human beings have been using cannabis from inception, ritually, spiritually, nutritionally, structurally. The plant produces over 500 natural compounds, and the most important compounds thus far are the cannabinoids that provides the psychoactive capability, the healing properties. You have the terpenes that give the aromatic profile, and you and I know drinking ginger tea is not the same as drinking mint tea. There is a different therapeutic value to these aromatics. And we have the flavonoids, the necessary flavor associated with other various cultivars. There are other plants that produce cannabinoids, but in terms of naturally, the cannabis plant is known to produce the highest concentrations of cannabinoids naturally. So the many uses of this plant range from pain to curing cancer to various ailments. The reason for this is because every advanced being, from arthropods to human beings to birds, will contain an endocannabinoid system. And this lipid system is there to regulate and maintain homeostasis within the individuals that patronize its usage. So it is well known that the human body produces endocannabinoids. So your own human, all higher beings produce cannabinoids endogenously. So if you take a look, a young child that suckles its baby's breast is always sleepy, always wants more milk. It's the cannabinoids in that milk that is causing that sort of feature to consistently feed in and be very relaxed by doing so. Also, if you exercise in the morning, after you exercise, the runner's high that you feel is associated with your endogenous cannabinoids. So cannabinoids exist as endocannabinoids. We have phytocannabinoids, which the plant produces, which the cannabis plant produces, and we have synthetic cannabinoids, that these cannabinoids are not produced by plants. They are produced by synthetic means, which are cell cultures from yeast, and this has been a problem in particular jurisdictions, particularly the first world, where we see synthetic cannabinoids being featured within the younger generation and youth. But also we have seen where synthetic cannabinoids are on the market in terms of medicinal products. So in terms of focusing more on the actual plant, as we will look at plant husbandry techniques and techniques that are going to get us past the traditional means and understanding commercial production from an economic point of view. So if Dominica is able to reach any capacity that we could export cannabis, these are some of the criteria that we would need to pay attention to. So, as we know, indica and sativa are common classifications for two types of cannabis. They are typically described as narrow-leaf cannabis and broad-leaf cannabis based on its morphological features. However, the taxonomy seems to be a bit skewed and creates a bit of ambiguity, because Carl Linnaeus in 1753 described cannabis sativa, but he was only privy to the hemp variety that was cultivated in East Europe, and he described the plant as cannabis sativa L. So the L stands for Linnaeus, which was the taxonomist. In 1785, Lamarck embarked on a trip to Afghanistan, Europe, India, Pakistan, and this is where he came across the broadleaf variety known as cannabis indica. So in ethnobotany, it is much more than just describing the plant from an indica sativa point of view, as we will see. So what we have been calling sativa for years is indeed a narrow-leaf drug type. And in the botanical description and using molecular techniques, we have known to understand that cannabis sativa is strictly referred to hemp cultivars. Hemp cultivars meaning that they produce very little or no psychoactive capabilities. Cannabis indica is what is considered the drug cultivars, and the drug cultivars produce cannabinoids that provide therapeutic medicine, psychoactive capabilities, and these are known as narrow-leaf drug types. So what we would refer to as sativa is really a narrow-leaf drug type indica plant, and the broadleaf plant is an broadleaf indica drug cultivar. So just to note, if you see the narrow-leaf drug type is more acclimatized for equatorial cultivation. As we can see, the leaves are much more skinnier and they have a lighter green, because within the tropics we are exposed to much more solar radiance. So the plant has developed morphological features to be able to mitigate and to reduce heat stress and photosynthesis and closing its stomata during critical times of the day. So you see the lighter green. However, the broadleaf drug type is a more temperate plant. And as you can see, the color green is much darker, meaning it is able to attract more solar radiance to the surface of the leaf. And the broadleaf signifies that in a temperate climate, you get a lot more cloud cover, less UV light entering entering the atmosphere. So the plant has designed to attract, to absorb as much sunlight as possible. So in terms of looking at the Caribbean's germplasm, during the 1960s, 1980s, the Caribbean developed an international reputation for cannabis. However, the Caribbean region is no stranger to cannabis. We have seen in the 1400s, on the arrival of the Spanish, was when they introduced hemp varieties to Cuba, specifically to help with the repair of their ships and sails. So the presence of these landrace cultivars really sort of evolved and acclimatized within the archipelago, meaning that the diurnal period, the photo period, the sunlight, all those really came together, the environmental conditions, and produced what we know as landrace. But these landrace are narrow-leaf drug cultivars. And the difference in cannabis, meaning is really the flowering time. So a broadleaf drug type, because it's in a temperate climate, it's going to flower for at least 7 days, 7 weeks, maximum 45 days. But a narrow-leaf drug type, because of the photo period, so on, which you will see on, really signifies the plant has a much longer maturation time. It flowers for 13 weeks. So the two extremes of cannabis today, you have plants that have a really short flowering time, 7 weeks, and you have the landrace plants that would flower for at least 13 to 15 weeks. But the physiological and morphological characteristics are somewhat different. As you can see in Dominica, the traditional weed, the traditional cannabis pretty much looks more like this. So this particular plant is more acclimatized to a humid environment, because the plant is able to mitigate the night dew, heavy rainfall, and still be able to flower for a much longer period to produce psychoactive components. On the other hand, in the 1980s to 1990s, Caribbean governments embarked on intensive eradication efforts, and that was used by paramilitary style, and that was sponsored by the United States government. And we have seen where the paramilitary style came in forms of biological warfare, where we see President Reagan installed scientists to breed Fusarium wilt and introduce cannabis cultivation areas to actually diminish their crops. We also see chemical warfare was used in the form of Agent Orange that was sprayed from helicopters to actually decimate the cannabis crops, but in turn it decimated other plants, it polluted our soil and our water systems. So in the 1990s, we saw the introduction of broadleaf drug cultivars entering the Caribbean jurisdiction, and these varieties typically came from Holland. The first known cultivars was AK-47, Hawaiian skunk, and white widow. And these strains came because of practical reasons. So think of it. You are a cannabis farmer and you are planting landrace plants. These plants would take sometimes 6 to 9 months to attain maturity. So a helicopter and law enforcement is eradicating cannabis. So what happens is the introduction of these broadleaf drug types saw a much more shorter life cycle of the cannabis plant. So planting from seed to harvest would take a period of 10 to 12 weeks. And you see just the flowering period for a landrace plant can be 13 weeks. So what happens is these plants stay extremely small because they cannot vegetate, because we don't have the long photo period during the summer days mimicking the temperate climates to attain sufficient biomass. But what happens, the farmers saw this as a practical reason because they could get to a crop faster and they were able to hide these plants from law enforcement easier, right? But these plants are more susceptible to disease, to pests, because they are not acclimatized for exploiting within this region. So in terms of to get economic yields from this particular cultivar, it takes a different approach towards cultivation. So today's world, we see unlimited strains, unlimited names. And this is the reason of hybridization. And hybridization simply means the crossing of two varieties. So cannabis enthusiasts has traveled the globe and they have collected seeds of many different cultivars, varieties, and cross-pollinate, and came up with some unique morphological and physiological characteristics and phytochemical characteristics, which is important because these provide the therapeutic and medical value. So these methods take conventional breeding techniques from back crossing. Sometimes it takes several generations to achieve the particular traits based on growth vigor, based on bud structure, based on color, based on phytochemical profile. So these desirable consequences of breeding polyploidy, and polyploidy is a typical agricultural technique where we convert wild plants into plants that would have significant economic value. Like a wild corn is not what a corn looks like today. It's pretty much a polyploidy. And these polyploidy generally have phenotypic traits that are distinct from diploids. And diploids mean those are the wild heterozygous plants. So these polyploidy plants tend to provide larger yields, greater growing vigor, and more suited to be exploited commercially. So in terms of types of cannabis seeds today, so I just want to state that if you are a traditional farmer and you've been planting cannabis for some time and all your life you are taking out male plants, and 99% of the chance that your cannabis has seeds is not a female, is not a male plant pollinated it. It's always a hermaphrodite. And think of that. Imagine 20 years, 30 years, 40 years of recultivating those seeds. It's pretty much a struggle, because if you germinate 100 seeds, a minimum of 50 seeds are going to display hermaphroditic traits. So commercially, we know that the commercial value of cannabis is in the unpollinated flower. So once the flower attains fertilization, the phytochemical profile, which has the economic and therapeutic value, could diminish by more than 50%. And it's very similar. Once a woman becomes pregnant, her behavior changes, her physiology changes, she goes into reproductive mode, and it's the same for the cannabis plant. So once the plant is fertilized, it does not produce trichomes anymore, because the trichomes are there in the hope that any pollen grain that blows in the wind, that cola would be able to stick and fertilize that pistil to produce seeds. So producing seedless cannabis is key to quality, value, and exploiting that commercial value of herb. So in today we have regular seeds, which in regular seeds you should get a 50% probability of male and female plants. Then we have feminized seeds, which are all female seeds. So if you are a traditional farmer and you get a hole of 100 feminized seeds, you plant one in each hole, it will be less input cost, it will be less labor, it will be less space to achieve greater yields and higher quality cannabis, which will be more uniform and be able to sell commercially internationally. And then we have the auto-flowering seeds. Auto-flowering seeds are considered they will, no matter the diurnal period or day length, they from seed to harvest is normally 100 and 120 days. However, we have not developed auto-flowering characteristics to be exploited for equatorial cultivation. So generally, because our diurnal period is pretty much stable, 12 hours of light, these photoperiod, these auto-flowering plants will stay very small and flower and don't provide you with these economic yield. So triploid seeds, they are not commercially available yet, but triploid seeds will be available very soon, and I'm sure they will be a staple within the commercialization. And triploid seeds are simply, if you understand what seedless grapes are, meaning that, to simply explain it, if you take a horse and you cross a horse with a donkey, you will get a mule. But a mule is sexually sterile. So this triploid is a sexually sterile plant that it cannot receive pollen. So no matter if you cultivate thousands, hundreds, if there is a male or there's a hermaphrodite, it will always be seedless. So looking at the planting and maturity. So as we know, in the tropics, the day length tends to fluctuate slightly. During the Christmas time, the days are pretty short, 12 hours of light, 12 hours of sunlight. Now we have passed the solstice and we get 13 hours of light. So any cannabis farmer would know that this time of year, your flowers tend to stretch and give you really skinny buds. So it's not really good to exploit certain cultivars or certain characteristics that display during certain times of the year. So planting cannabis in an equatorial climate, we need to know what to plant, when to plant, and how do we plant it to exploit these economic gains. So the difference really is in the vegetative growth. And as you know, many of us now may be using supplemental lighting to extend these photoperiod, because cannabis is maybe one of the most sensitive plants to photoperiod, meaning that any disturbance during the night cycle is going to have a physiological effect on the plant, which will not allow the plant to flower. So once the plant experiences 18 hours of light and 6 hours of darkness, the plants will never show you sexual traits, and they will continue to vegetate. So that's why when you look at social media and you see those plants in California 9 feet, 10 feet tall, is because in California and in the northern climate, during the summer, the sun pretty much sets at late at 10 o'clock. So these plants can grow vegetatively, but in the tropics, because of our 12-12 photoperiod, the use of supplemental lighting to maintain mother plants and vegetative capacity, it's important, because you can veg and generate the biomass that you would need to exploit commercially. So in terms of looking at particular varieties that would have commercial exploitation for cultivation within the cannabis, this is the sort of criteria that my students and I go through to determine if a particular cultivar has that sort of efficacy and value to be exploited commercially, because you may be growing a particular strain, but you're putting way too much inputs, way too much labor to get very substantial yields that would not bring you that economic viability. So it's very tedious, and we go through this product. So I'm going to just show you some data. I have a lot of data, but I can only present some here today. What happened here? Oh, all right. So this is the first graph now. All right, I think I'm missing a graph, but anyway. Okay, so this graph displays the average weight of 10 different cultivars. So you could see the bigger seeds were cultivar D and cultivar E, And the graph on the side displays the average length of these seeds. So you could see the average length and width of the seeds. You could see seed D, E, and D were pretty much the larger seeds. This particular graph demonstrates the potential of viability of these seeds. So what happens in agriculture, it is detrimental to wait until you germinate the seeds to know the sustainability of these particular strains cultivating. I see I have 5 minutes left, but yeah. So I don't know. I will try to go through. I'll try to go through this as fast as I can. All right. So in terms of this graph here displays that shows you germinating the seed directly within the open field versus germinating the seed within a sort of protected environment gives you way more success. These average so this shows you the hypocotyl length. The hypocotyl length is pretty much the stem of the seedling. So on my left, it shows you open field directly seeding in the ground versus propagating these plants within a propagation room. So we could see much better growth taking place via using a propagation room. These graphs now display the average number of branches and leaves per week during the vegetative period. So we can see on average cultivar B and cultivar F is putting on significantly different numbers based on vegetative growth. So it's putting on more leaves and branches compared to the other cultivars. These graphs now show you the vegetative period along with the flowering time, and we can see where our cultivars B and F are still showing that significant difference based on generating significant biomass. So if you go back, we would see that the larger seed that showed the fastest growth as a seedling did not necessarily translate to the plant that is generating more significant biomass. So in terms of the post-harvest data, we see the difference in flowering time for these hybrids. We could see the percentage THC from 16, the highest was 22.9% THC, and we can see the total weight. So we have the bud weight, trim weight, stem weight, and total weight. So we can assess the productivity of a particular cultivar and understand growing this particular cultivar commercially could be exploited based on its physiological, morphological, and phytochemical profile. So in terms of harvesting, everything we grow cannabis for is in these trichome glands. The cannabinoids, the terpenes, the flavonoids are all in these glands. So preserving these glands and making those glands mature properly is very instrumental to exploiting that economic potential of this plant. So what happens in the tropics, because of poor post-harvest techniques, we tend to lose majority of these bulbous and stalked, trichomes. So under temperatures of 30 degrees Celsius, the larger trichomes simply just melt off the plant. And because they are microscopic, it's hard to see. But we have looked at plants microscopically and see that under deplorable conditions, you tend to diminish the efficacy and quality of the actual flower. So you could see the sort of concentration of trichomes present on that flower. In terms of harvesting, we use organoleptic qualities to evaluate whether these trichomes are mature, because we want to ensure that the trichomes have maximum saturation of cannabinoids, terpenes, and flavonoids. And there are microscopic techniques that we use to determine when these trichomes are ripe. So we go for maximum preservation of trichomes. What happens is the terpene profile, the terpenes are volatile at over 20 degrees Celsius. So once the plant is harvested, in order to preserve these trichomes, the temperature must be maintained to not allow for the volatilization of these compounds. So this is critical. There's 2 minutes and I will try to go through this. So the quality assurance of cannabis is going to be key. And this is where public-private partnerships and the government really would need to get its act, together to be able to put the infrastructure in place to facilitate economic commerce. And because we are administering a therapeutic and medical commodity, maintaining public health and safety and environmental stewardship is going to be very key. So the development of standards. In Jamaica, we developed 3 local standards: a cultivation standard, a processing standard, and packaging and labeling standard. So a cannabis consumer today is not willing to allow their euphoria as chance. They are able to predict the euphoria they want. So you are able to cultivate cultivars consistently and replicating the same phytochemical concentration, because if you want to feel uplifting, you use a particular strain that works with you. If you want to relax and so on, there are particular phytochemical profiles that allow for these different feelings and value and preventative and curative measures. So understanding the phytochemical profile is key. So post-harvest storage, developing the infrastructure to develop that is going to be key, and this will allow the medical practitioners more confidence in administering cannabis medicine. So this is a pictorial diagram that shows you all the various pathogens and pests that could be associated with these plants. So doing the right plant diagnostics is going to be key, and getting clean planting material. The majority of germplasm that we have in the Caribbean seems to be compromised by diseases, viruses, and various pathogens. So in terms of if you are to exploit the commercial aspect, we need to develop standard operating procedures, and this is just a few. So how you deal with your buildings facility, how you maintain sanitization, how you calibrate and clean equipment, how you cultivate, how you sterilize your soil, how you fertilize, how you irrigate. All these things need to be documented, because if there is a voluntary or mandatory recall, we must be able to go through the value chain and check these records to be able to know. So no one is able to export cannabis without 148 SOPs, and these are the standard operating procedures for managing your staff to your product leaving your facility. Testing for safe cannabis. We need to be able to verify the level of heavy metal contents in these plants. As you know, it's very detrimental if you consume these at high concentration. Microbial testing is key, because these can cause serious lung diseases and so forth. So this is a study that was conducted by a colleague of mine that I collaborated with in the Department of Microbiology, where we looked at dispensary cannabis versus unregulated cannabis, and this is preliminary data. So from 60 samples collected, we saw 59 of the samples grew at least one species of fungus and bacteria, and we saw 145 moles. And these are Aspergillus species, and these are most known. These can cause serious lung infection. Testing potency is key, because we need to understand what's the phytochemical profile in these plants. So in terms of my conclusion, the Caribbean archipelago is unique in its biogeography and socio-economic demographics. What my research has pointed out, first world countries have decriminalized and facilitated medical programs because of medical persuasion. But in the developing world, it has been slightly different. The driving force has been restorative justice. We don't want to criminalize people for possession of small quantities. So enacting correct cannabis legislation around all Caribbean territories is a very complex and interconnected pattern. Cannabis is possibly the most traded horticultural commodity in its raw state and catches the highest economic value regionally. So how do we encapsulate that within a legal framework? The illegal trade facilitates the farmer and the consumer profits the least, the middleman profits the most, and this is where the violence and so on take place within the trade. In the Windward Islands, data from seizures have definitely solidified the value of cannabis having more economic potential more than bananas did in its heyday. So in my conclusion, how are the regional governments are going to be able to strategize, develop, integrate a formal cannabis economy surrounding the cultivation, processing, transportation? So an integrated approach is definitely needed from an interdisciplinary standpoint. So academic institutions, public, private sector, all these would need to collaborate and coordinate and ensure a level playing field for its participants. I thank you very much.
Wow, yes, very, very, very interesting information. I mean, I want to compliment Dr. Marshall Emanuel for a tremendous presentation. And I think he has a lot more to say, but due to time constraints, we have to move on. But we left a session in the afternoon, and definitely Dr. Emanuel could come again and bless us with all that information that he has. But without further ado, our next presenter will be online. He is Mr. Algernon Roberts. He's going to look at the existing legal framework and the roadmap used for the legalization of cannabis in Antigua. Mr. Algernon Roberts is a pharmacist and founder and CEO of ALCO. He holds a master's in pharmacy from University of Nottingham, diploma of pharmacy from University of Technology in Jamaica, and diploma in pharmacy from Alberton Hospital School of Pharmacy. He also holds a master's in business administration from UWI. Roberts acquired songwriting and reporting skills from years of experience. He has been the presenter of numerous health talk programs in Antigua, and he has experience in working with cultural diverse teams. He enjoys public speaking, cricket, and bike riding. So we are just gonna await Mr. Roberts. So this is a different sort of symposium. We try to cater for regional perspectives, local, so it's a physical as well as a virtual medium. So it's addressing these areas of technology when you try to integrate both physical and virtual methodologies. But hopefully Mr. Roberts will be joining us short.
And you are tuned in, of course, to live
some
coverage
of the
Cannabis
highlights of
Symposium,
Dr. Emanuel
from traditional cultivation to the
presentation,
commercialization of cannabis,
I
of course,
think
hosted by the
leaves a lot
newly
of
open
room
campus
for
Dominica
sort
in
of
collaboration with the
thinking
Rastafari
about cannabis a little deeper
White
in terms of the research work that has been done,
Societies Limited,
the classifications, the approaches needed to
course,
actually develop a cannabis industry.
We just heard from the first
It's
presenter,
interesting. I'm
Dr.
going to
Marshall
pose a
Emanuel.
question. I don't know if anyone
His focus was on traditional cultivation to
with respect to
commercialization
the
of cannabis
different types of
sativa.
cannabinoids.
Must say it was
I think
quite a
my
lot of
intention
information,
that
comprehensive information,
within the
well
human
detailed,
system,
and I'm sure that our listeners were certainly
one moment
well informed as per cannabis and the history of cultivation in the Caribbean, and as well as the future for development of cultivation as the focus is from traditional cultivation to commercialization of cannabis, and he certainly did a wonderful job with that presentation. Right now, we are currently awaiting the presentation from Mr. Algernon Roberts. His focus will be on the existing legal framework and the roadmap used for the legalization of cannabis in Antigua. So if you're just tuning in, we are bringing you live coverage of the Cannabis Symposium from the UE Open Campus Dominica site, of course the auditorium, with a focus from traditional cultivation to commercialization of cannabis. Of course, we'll only be bringing you the first half of today's symposium. Of course, if you would like, you can make your way down to the UE Open Center Dominica site for the continuation of that symposium this afternoon. So we'll only be bringing you the first half, but the symposium will continue throughout the morning and into the mid-afternoon as well.
Looked at the different types of varieties of cannabis, the broadleaf and the narrow-leaf cannabis. We are accustomed of looking at it as the sativa and the indica, but we understood the advantage with these two different types of strains when it comes to the photosynthetic abilities of these plants, the narrow leaf and the broad leaf cannabis. And we looked at the research work that he was attempting to present, or he presented. I think we need to really take a little more time to really go through it, because he sort of browsed through it due to time constraints, and I don't think a lot of us really understood this sort of data that has been captured and what he was really presenting. But it's indeed a lot of data and interesting information that we have to definitely kind of look at in a Dominican manner in terms of the research work that needs to be done in developing the cannabis industry. Mr. Algernon Roberts, we are still waiting your presentation. Seeing you on there, but we're not sure what's happening. Also, Dr. Emanuel was looking at some of the infrastructure that's necessary, the public-private partnership that's needed to develop our cannabis industry. I think, all hands have to come on board and really explore the areas in which they can play a part. And yeah. So once again, congrats to Dr. Marshall Emanuel in the strides that he has made and the work that he has been doing in the cannabis industry in the region. I think that we definitely need to applaud the work of Dr. Emanuel and his efforts in building that cannabis industry for the region. And as we mentioned earlier, he's a son of the soil. So, Dominica, we definitely have something to our advantage. When we reached out to Dr. Emanuel to assist in the symposium, it was just open hands. He didn't hesitate. He just provided all the advice that he could give in really structuring the symposium, how we should consider certain things. So I'm definitely proud of Dr. Emanuel and the work that he has been doing in the cannabis industry. Now, our next presenter is actually here with us. So in case Mr. Algernon Roberts, once again we're making a call and for some reason or the other he's unable to connect. Okay, so due to some technical issues, we're just trying to make the connection. But however, due to the fact that, everyone is waiting both online and physically here with us, we could move on to our next presenter, and after the next presenter, Mr. Algadon Roberts, we could always swap the presentations. So, okay, I see that he is on. It's just the Mr. Roberts, we're not hearing you, so our technicians are sort of trying to address that issue. So whilst, go to the next one. All right. So sorry again for this, this setback with technology. I will quickly introduce the next presenter, our one and only Miss Roseanne Charles, Dominican again. Miss Roseanne Charles is an attorney at law. She holds an LLB from UWKville, and she received her legal education certificate from Woden Law School. Miss Charles also holds a Master's of Law in International Law and Development from Nottingham University. Miss Charles provides legal services to local and international clients in areas which include civil litigation, employment law, family law, land law, conveyances, and company law. In addition, since 2015, she has served as chairperson of the Physical Planning Appeals Board, and she is a board member of Invest Dominica Authority. Could we welcome Ms. Roseanne Charles? Due to protocol issues, we need to always sanitize, so.
Good day to everybody present. Thank you for inviting me to present as part of this symposium. Okay, the topic that I'll be presenting today is the existing legal framework and the recommendations and amendments to be made for the legalization of cannabis in Dominica. I will first just briefly look at the present legal framework. Despite changing public attitudes, which I think most of us are aware of, the greater acceptance of cannabis, and also the awareness that the use of cannabis could have medicinal as well as commercial uses. The legislation, it still remains in the laws that it is regarded as a dangerous substance. Cannabis under our laws is still regarded as a dangerous substance. The Drugs Prevention of Misuse Act, Chapter 4007 of the Dominica Revised Laws, states in its preamble that its purpose is to make provisions with respect to dangerous and otherwise harmful drugs and related matters, and for the purpose connected therewith. Cannabis remains one of the substances which are listed and classified under the Act. Cannabis and cannabis resin are listed in the third schedule of the Act as Class B controlled drugs. The Act also includes a fourth schedule which sets out the punishment for offenses under the Act pertaining to the different classes of controlled drugs. There have been amendments made, one in 1993. What that did basically was to expand the definition of drug trafficking and impose stiffer penalties for the offense. Then we move to, let us say, close to 20 years later. There was a recent amendment made in 2020. That is the Drugs Prevention of Misuse Amendment Act Act 16 of 2020. What this amendment did really was to decriminalize some use of cannabis. For example, Section 7.2 of the Act provides that, subject to regulations under Section 9, it shall not be lawful for a person to have a controlled drug in his possession. The 2020 Act has amended that Section 7 so that a person who has 28 grams or less of cannabis or cannabis resin is not guilty of an offense under that Section 7.2, which prohibits the possession of cannabis. So what it effectively did was it changed the situation that existed prior to 2020. So a person who would have been in possession of 15 grams of cannabis or cannabis resin was deemed to be in possession with intent to supply. And that part of the legislation more or less was almost a strict liability sort of section. So it placed the onus really on the person who was found having more than the stated amount to explain why it is that they were in possession of that amount. It automatically assumes, it still does, it's just that it just raised the threshold from 15 to 28. It still assumes that if you are in possession of a greater amount than that stipulated, that you intend to supply. The 2020 amendment also allows for a person who is 18 years or older to cultivate not more than 3 plants of the genus cannabis at the place where he resides permanently. Now, while the 2020 amendments have allowed for some relaxation of the laws pertaining to the use of cannabis, cannabis continues to be listed as a dangerous substance, and there has been no change to several of the offenses created by the legislation. Now, while there is that legislation, we often get the public response that, especially where people are convicted and then they are sentenced or they are fined, you get the public response of why is it that this is still on the books? Why is it that people still are being more or less punished for having small amounts of cannabis or so in their possession, be that it is above the threshold created by the legislation? So the fact is the magistrates whose job it is to apply the law, their hands are basically tied. Unless we determine that we want law revision or law reform that, on the books, then there's always the possibility that there is the criminalization of persons who breach the particular provisions of the statute. So that now takes us into the issue of law reform. So since there is the public concern, and we see it sometimes, if you look, there are times when people are found with so many trees, or they're found with X amount of marijuana in their possession. You see the responses, sometimes on Facebook, sometimes on other sites. Something like, are they still sending people to jail for marijuana? As long as it remains an offense, then basically the people who are applying the law, the magistrates or the judicial officers, they have no choice really but to, there's a very little discretion that is afforded them in terms of applying the law and also handing down the sentences. So I think something that we have to consider is whether there has been sufficient legislative changes made in respect of cannabis, given public attitudes which have changed over the decades, and also given our present social and economic realities. Why do we have law reform? I think most of us are aware of the statement that The only constant really is change. So we live in a society where we ourselves, we change our minds, we change the way we view things, and also the laws are supposed to be dynamic. They're not supposed to be static. They should be relevant to the needs of the society in which they operate. And then we have to also pay, one of the things we have to consider as well is the major function of a legal system, which is to respond to changes in society, to resolve societal issues as they develop, and to respond to scientific and economic developments. It is important that laws change as the needs of society change. Law reform and law development is therefore a necessary facet of our democratic system. The process of implementing new legislation and amending existing legislation does not usually begin in Parliament. There's a lot that happens before the bills are actually debated. The legislative process most often begins with legislative policy, which originates in government ministries and departments and from other public bodies within government. So before the bills are even presented, there are consultations that take place, there are discussions, there are policies that take into account the feedback which were received from stakeholders, and of course, international obligations, regional obligations, and so on. So government policy is frequently influenced by recommendations from regional and international bodies. And one of those, I think, which has influenced and which should, I think, continue to influence government policy is a recent report which was prepared by the CARICOM Regional Commission on Marijuana. And this report reflects the regional public's view on issues pertaining to reform of legislation concerning cannabis. The Commission found that most of the public in the region were of the opinion that the existing prohibitionist regime created more harm than any possible adverse result of cannabis itself. So that's the type of regime we have. It's prohibitionist. It's more or less says don't use except, or basically it says don't use, or it creates offenses for activities pertaining to cannabis. So the report stated that the legalization of cannabis could result in reduction in costs of law enforcement, and that is understandable because cannabis the use of it is regarded very much like a victimless crime. So rather than spending resources going after two teenagers somewhere in a corner or some guys, why not utilize that for other issues, for example, like child abuse or violent crimes? You know, the report stated that the public's opinion was that it would save costs if the resources were moved away from policing cannabis basically to other more pertinent breaches of the law. Additionally, there was an economic study as well, and it showed that the highest financial benefits would come from a fully legalized model that is strictly regulated, and the lowest benefit would come from decriminalization only. So we are at the stage basically where we have somewhat decriminalized some use, but we haven't gone to the full stage of legalizing. We haven't legalized cannabis. And I think we haven't considered the seriously, I think we haven't considered, for example, the benefits that could be derived from legalization of cannabis. I don't know, for some reason we still cling to that prohibitionist sort of mentality. Yeah, but I think we, even as a group, as a region, have to think, and it came up in the report too. I said, yeah, that is, we have to think that there are some states in the US that they, like Colorado, for example, where they have legalized cannabis. So we have to take a mature look at things. And you know, sometimes, maybe we're afraid sometimes of backlash, but we have to factor that in as well. I think if we try to deal with it as a group, it might be in our interest, rather than if you know, each state try to deal with it on its own, basically. But these are things that we have to consider. So, and with law reform, as I said, there's always public consultation. So it's something that is ongoing, and I think that is necessary. So something I think in the regulations, there are regulations that go with the Act, and the regulations allow the minister to grant licenses, even for research purposes. Has it ever been utilized? I could not find any instance that it was. So, you are aware of that? Okay, well, from... Oh.
Because the state government is the one that supposed to have like completely the state symposium. Nothing done.
Okay. Okay.
They call it boss. He's lazy.
Okay, thank you for the intervention, Charlie. Okay, so, but the minister, it does allow some discretion in terms of granting licenses. And it does allow for administration of some of the controlled substances for medical reasons. But there's some apprehension, it seems, because I couldn't find any instance where Charlie said there was, where there was authorization for use for research or for medical reasons. But it is in the legislation. Yes, I think it's... Okay, so anyway, one of the recommendations coming from that same report, which was partially implemented in the 2020 amendment, is the ban of smoking in public places and the exceptions which were made for smoking by Rastafarians in public. But I don't think that there was, they took into account the recommendation that there should be designated places or spaces where people could smoke. And that, of course, ties in with the commercialization or the commercial use or development of a cannabis industry. Because if you say that you kind of restrict it only to use it in your home, what of if you need to use it, say, for tourism or for some other reasons? Like my understanding is there are some designated places in St. Vincent where you can. So they didn't. I don't think they factored in the commercial use of cannabis. We still are in that mindset of prohibition. Well, it was taken into account, but for Rastafarians, okay, but not commercial. There was no. I think there was not sufficient done. As a matter of fact, it's more prohibitory. Like you can't smoke. There were no designated areas. For example, if you have like a cafe or maybe if in a hotel or something where you are allowed to smoke, they didn't make any provisions for that. Actually, they were more or less prohibiting it in public spaces generally. So there are other issues that would have to be considered. For example, the social effects, social policy concerns, and so on. And there's movement towards looking at drug use more as a public health concern rather than a matter that should be dealt with by the criminal justice system. So I think we have to consider the growing trends, growing global trends towards decriminalization. And I even think we should move beyond that and go to legalization of cannabis. But in a responsible, I think it has to be in a responsible, mature, and regulated way. And we also have to factor in some of the adverse effects that may result. How are we going to deal with some of those issues? For example, there were some concerns, and it comes up, about if you go into commercial use, how are you going to manage some of the experiences that we have had with collaborating with international institutions or international investors. Intellectual property rights, and also ensure that we do not end up at a disadvantage in our arrangements or agreements with foreign investors. From the this position where we are, I think we are more the type of regime that we have is a regime where we have just more or less decriminalized marijuana use only. The 2020 amendment to the Drugs Act allows for possession of small amounts, and breach of those sections result in fines rather than arrest and incarceration. As to whether that is sufficient, have we gone far enough? I think that is something that we have to consider. Just something as quickly to, if we are going to make any amendments, or if we go into legalization, I think we have to consider issues like our treaty obligations, because we have signed on to some international treaties pertaining to the misuse of drugs and trafficking and so on. So we have to consider those things. We also have to consider issues about money laundering and also proceeds of crime. So if it is that we legalize cannabis and we develop a cannabis industry, I think those are some of the issues that we have to consider. Either we have to consider how are we going to tackle some of those issues. I think the best way to deal with it, and it came out of the report as well, I agree with that, is I think we have to do it as a regional group, because as individuals it will be very difficult. Also, we can learn from the experiences. That's a good thing about not being first. We can learn from the experiences of other islands, of other states that have legalized cannabis. So,
may I make one point?
Yes. Yes, go ahead.
Something that confronts the Dominican citizens on a daily basis is you have laws on possession and intent weight of the cannabis that they have. When the court is trying to implement these guidelines, the question arises as to what is the street value of the weight presented. And the court takes the view of the prosecutor who gets his view from the police, that 6 trees constitute a pound, and a pound is valued at $1,000. Now that 6 trees include the stick, the branches, the root, and if it had dirt in it when they put it in the ground, it weighs. Now, how can that be? I mean, anybody who's involved in or aware of marijuana knows from not $1,000. Nobody gets $1,000. And a stick and a male trainer cannot be valued. Street value. That has to be addressed as soon as possible because people suffer.
Yeah. But okay. Fine. Okay. Okay.
Somebody has 3 male plants, or 5 male plants, 6 male plants, they get knocked out. There is no value added to those plants.
Thank you. But may I just respond? Because I think that is the importance. Thank you, Dr. Emanuel and Mr. Allen. But I think all of these things are things that matters that we have to consider. And with law reform and law revision, you always need the intervention of practitioners who are, like you, Mr. Allen, who have the experience and know the difficulties that arise. And you also need the input of scientific people like you, Mr. Emanuel, because I think were these considerations taken into account, maybe we would have a different wording, basically. But I think just generally, if there was legalization, all of these sorts of issues, we would not have to be dealing with things, and the social policy considerations as well, I think, are very important to the discussion. Okay. I think that there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Roseanne, for that very insightful contribution. Just to inform some housekeeping, that we do have a question and answer segment that will follow, and we have some online virtual speakers. So if you could just write down your questions. I know at the moment you may have a thought, but if you could write it down and we'll address it during that period. So thank you again, Rose, and you have indeed informed us of the approach, because laws in itself is based on what are we trying to achieve, what are we trying to resolve, and we need the feedback of everyone in order to regulate and to address certain issues. That being said, we also have to consider Dr. Emanuel's point of view, where he did inform us that we need the hows, the whens, the what, the where, the infrastructure. We need a lot in order to reach our goal. At this point in time, we have Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine, who will be presenting to us virtually. Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine is the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal Designate of UWI St. Augustine. She is the former Dean of the Faculty of Law, UWI St. Augustine. She holds a doctorate in law from Oxford, a master's in law from Cambridge, a bachelorate in law from the UWI, and certificates in international human rights from the IIHR Institute in Strasbourg. Antoine is an attorney, award-winning scholar, and author, international consultant, temporary Court of Appeal judge, and an activist. She was elected president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Washington. She's also the OAS Rapporteur for Persons of African Descent and Discrimination, the Rapporteur for Indigenous Peoples, and the head of the OAS Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Unit. She has served as CARICOM Chair on HIV, Migration, and the Regional Commission on Marijuana. In addition, Antoine is the president of the Family Planning Association, a Cambridge Fellow, a member of Trinidad and Tobago's Industrial Relations Advisory Committee, an honorary fellow of the International Society for Trust Practitioners, STEP, and a trustee of the London International Planned Parenthood Federation Board. She enjoys painting and gardening and is a trained classical singer. We welcome Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here. I was in Dominica in 2018. I gave a full speech based on the report that and the commission's report that I chair, the CARICOM Commission on Marijuana. And I'm glad to see that we've had some gains there. It was an important and is still an important impetus for law reform in the region, and that was the purpose of the commission. I saw the former speaker, Rose, did cite it and read from it, so I'm trying not to be repetitive. And I'm glad to see that since 2018, we did have some amendments in the Dominican law, but I do agree there's room for a lot more to happen. I've entitled my presentation Important Gains and Future Prospects. I think the first important gain is that I think we have actually won the battle of minds. It's not, I don't believe in the region, still a huge issue that marijuana laws should be changed. The question is to what degree, what focus. We need to change the status quo. We've started, we need to go further. Dominica was not part of the original consultations when we went around the region, but in 2018, I think we sort of rectified that. So it's a no-brainer, really. I am very concerned about the emphases of law reform. Can I just confirm that you're hearing me? I see somebody is moving around because we did have this morning. Is everyone hearing me?
We are hearing you loud and clear.
Okay, great. Thank you. I know we had some difficulties. Yes, I think we've had too much emphasis on medical marijuana, but not enough on the social justice issues which still remain, and too much emphasis, in my view, on the industry, but the sort of the big business perspective, which of course is linked to the medical marijuana issue, not as an end to itself, because I think industry is really what we should be looking for, social development. But in our industry plans, too much we are forgetting the lessons of history and exacerbating inequity, persistent poverty, and neocolonialism by essentially excluding the farmers who really sought to liberate ganja, in particular the Rastafarian community. And sadly, this is a big issue in Jamaica. I had warned of it in the report, but now we are seeing this coming to bear. And even St. Vincent to a lesser extent, although I think St. Vincent's doing a better job of being inclusive. Jamaica recently said they have to redo all of their laws essentially. But there is overwhelming support for law reform, and certainly for move away from prohibition and criminalization. And I'm happy that the CARICOM Commission was an important catalyst. Even before we did our report, the mere fact that CARICOM convened a commission gave important impetus and support for law reform and social reform. And we know that others were championing the Rastas or the prominent persons and so on. In 2018, the statistics were like 60-something% in the region supported it. But after we began to see law reform changes, we've gotten to even 90-something%. Jamaica has been doing the data. And we still believe, and Caribbean people certainly believe, that the laws generally are ineffective. They're discriminatory, they're unjust, they lack legitimacy, and they certainly don't conform to human rights, and they certainly do not take advantage of whatever economic opportunities exist in the industry and in medical research. And I'm so happy that Dr. Emanuel is their champion researcher. And also, of course, prohibiting access to proper medicine that can heal us more cheaply than in traditional pharmaceuticals. And the report, as I said, some of it was already talked about this morning, but I've always maintained, and we have maintained, that the laws which exist, it's really bad law. In the same way that slave laws were bad law, Nazi laws were bad law, because there was no real justification for those laws. It was not based on empirical evidence. There was no real social harm or wrong, which laws are supposed to have. It was really a result of propaganda combined with attempts to restrict to competition with the emerging alcohol industry and even racism. And we have lots of documentation to support that now. And so they created this criminalized 2016, which really demonized ganja, demonized cannabis stroke marijuana, and gave it this very negative image that we have today, deeming it a dangerous drug without any value, when we know, and now scientists is that it does have tremendous value as a medical substance, and not just medical in a narrow way, but where they love to say recreational drug, but I don't know if I like that term too much. What it does is to calm persons' minds, etc. So things like that. So the laws were really based on a legal fiction, and we created a criminal law which was extremely draconian, as all of us know, which down-pressed thousands of people without any evidence that it was actually harmful. And it took nearly a century to reverse this. In fact, it was only a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, I've lost track of time because of COVID, when the WHO finally removed that classification as a dangerous drug from its books. And that is a tremendous gain. That reclassification, at least from one international body, it is still being fought out on the international plane, but that reclassification is a huge advantage for law reform. It gives a lot of legitimacy, and it allows us not only the freedom to legalize, as opposed to decriminalize, as Rose, I didn't get the last name, but I saw she had a name similar to mine, Rosemary, as I remember, is a huge advantage for law reform, because we can now legalize without as much international condemnation. And also, when we do that, we can address some of the banking and the financial anomalies that come from building an industry with a substance that is deemed illegal. So money laundering issues, proceeds of crime issues. So it's not over yet, the challenge in relation to the international treaties, but we have made some significant gains there as well. And we know too that cannabis has deep historical, cultural, and religious significance in the Caribbean. I always like to quote what I learned from the Rastafarian community of Genesis, when they quoted, "Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb, but I have given you all things." And this was cited to us many times in our constitutions. And just to be certain, I am not condemning the development of the medical stream. Cannabis, no, I agree. But what I'm saying is cannabis only focus about the first products from cannabis, cannasol, for instance, treatment for glaucoma, came from this region, came from the UE, Professor West. So it's really doing that as well as correcting social injustices. And we know that having laws which are deemed illegal as opposed to being decriminalized, there's an important psychological focus here, because it still means that it's being demonized. So you only sort of sanitize it partially, but it is still, in some sense, illegal unless you legalize. So I've always felt, although our report didn't go all the way, we made suggestions, but me personally, and I said it in the Dominica in 2018, I certainly believe, and most of us actually at the Commission did believe, that it should be legalized outright. But we gave, I suppose, a sort of a first step to those countries that weren't quite ready as yet. But I think now we should be ready because of the overwhelming evidence and the practical value of doing that. So laws matter. And when you deem something illegal, it matters in terms of the kinds of image and the kinds of consequences that flow, and I think that is the most important justification. So we see it, those of us on the Commission and those of us still involved now in another group, a regional group that looks at the industry, we see it as a public health issue, we see it as a human rights issue, as a commercial issue, and certainly issues of social justice, which should affect all of us, and does in fact affect all of us, should be a priority. And we should move away completely from this prohibitionist regime and this so-called war on drugs. I don't know if we still talk about war on drugs. It was such a counterproductive phenomenon. And that stance of the law of illegality, prohibition, and draconian, and so on, that really, we have seen, produce much more harm than any possible adverse consequences of cannabis itself. Yeah? So we have made gains, but not enough gains in terms of the law. The law is still quite incongruous, still somewhat obsolete, still unjust, still ineffective, because people are violating the laws every day. It never really worked. But we made some gains, we made a one step, but we need to go a lot further, especially when we consider all of the scientific and medical evidence. We've always said and continue to say that we accept that cannabis is a substance with psychoactive properties, and I know some of you were talking about it earlier, although we couldn't hear properly. So there is potential for negative health consequences as well as positive, as with but there's enough uncertainty about it in order to put that baseline, and then those in specific risk situations. So there's more research needed for that as well, and that can be easily managed by a proper regulatory system as opposed to illegalization and demonization. What I think is important is the evidence which has shown that some of what our biggest fears were, what I call the myths, that has already been discredited. The gateway theory that if you use cannabis then you will go on to use crack and all of these other things, even the addiction and the issues to do with psychosis. And studies have continued. Prof. Abel, for example, has continued those studies, and the evidence is showing that it is not at all true. And certainly when you compare it to alcohol, alcohol is far more dangerous. I know many of you know this already, so I rushed through this in terms of the time for today. But on balance, the risks, the benefits far outweigh the risks, and this is also something that international studies have shown, which gives credit to a rights-based public health, non-permissionist approach, and full legalization. So we're saying regulate, but don't illegalize. You can regulate just as you regulate alcohol or tobacco, as the case may be, and take away all of these negative impacts of the regime that we really have today. I'm particularly concerned about the young people who are currently using cannabis throughout the region with impunity, would appear. We heard from a lot of them, and we believe in education in relation to that and persuasion. And of course, we all know about the warehousing, the jails being overflowing. Otherwise, law-abiding citizens caught with small amounts, and now we've put in limits for small amounts, but if you have 1 gram more than a small amount that is now allowed under the law, you could end up potentially with the same in the same situation. And I recall in St. Vincent when they first came out with their law, which emphasized medical, I said to the Prime Minister and the ministers, I said, but you haven't even decriminalized in terms of small amounts, because they were saying, well, we wouldn't prosecute. Well, that is bad law to say, but we leave it up to the discretion of the police and the discretion of the lawmakers, and don't change the law. And of course, not long after, some right person decided to arrest others. So this is a difficulty when you don't spell things out in law. So we've had this happening for a long time. Some countries saying, well, we wouldn't bother to prosecute. But that is a very precarious position to have a legal system in. And of course, the other flip side to that is other persons and regimes over-prosecute. So that whole uncertainty in the law, and also how wasteful and costly it has been, how we've been conducting our affairs, the lives that we've destroyed, including the families, and the gender dimensions, which is something we're also concerned about in terms of women being incarcerated and whole families being destroyed. And just to say to you that we had police commissioners and assistant commissioners on our commission, and they too agreed that this was unproductive. They also believed it was ineffective, that their resources were better employed elsewhere. They also disagreed that marijuana, cannabis caused the criminal activity. We did research and statistics, and they told us too. They said no, that they didn't see that connection. They felt that making it illegal or having a prohibitionist legal regime caused violence because of the protection of turf, and also because some persons are attracted or they want to go and experiment. So they saw legalization as actually reducing crime. So all of these things are very important in terms of, yes, the gains, but the future prospects, how far we should go in relation to cannabis. And it also encouraged unsafe production of various chemicals, strange derivatives of cannabis, which I'm sure your scientists can talk about. So in terms of legal policy, it's a regime that is subject to abuse, unenforceable law, inappropriate, irrelevant, and I certainly believe erodes the rule of law, especially when you consider the harsh penalties. And although the harsh penalties going forward in some countries, like in Dominica, will only be for certain amounts, it is still harsh. There's very little discretion, as Rose mentioned. In some countries, in fact, mandatory penalties. And what is also quite disturbing is that you still, even with the changes that we have made, you can still, in almost every country, if not every country, end up with harsher penalties for cannabis, whether possession or supposed trafficking, than you could for offenses like assault and so, which are, against a person, because we know possession, trafficking, and so on. Well, maybe not trafficking, but certainly possession it doesn't affect any other person except yourself. And so we had really horrible examples, and we still have horrible examples, that you can get up to 40 years in Trinidad and Tobago. In Dominica, the laws were even talking about life imprisonment for trafficking, whereas you can almost kill someone and get a non-custodial sentence. Something has to be wrong with laws like that. Certainly no provision for rehabilitation, which is something we want to encourage going forward, especially for young persons or anybody who is found in possession. And we can, as the UN system contemplates, the convention contemplates, alternatives to imprisonment, rehabilitation, re-education. None of us are doing that. That is something that we need to do moving forward. So this disproportionate, unjust, and unproductive. So, as was said to us many times, a plant is not a criminal. So it's really travesties of our justice system, and human rights concerns, equity are really quite deep. We all know by now, and I've said this so many times, I just skimmed through this, so we all know the kinds of discrimination biases, inherent biases in terms of prosecution. Even the police admitted that to us, that it was much easier to arrest the poor person who doesn't have a big fancy house, just living on the street.
Cannabis Symposium
There were also
with a
race
theme from
implications.
traditional cultivation
Not you and I
to
getting
commercialization
arrested.
of cannabis. Of course, that's being hosted at the auditorium of the Open Campus, and that's being done by the Rastafari Identity White
On the other hand, we look at Hollywood and television, we see cannabis being some sort of glamour, something very hip.
And
but
of course, in
the
collaboration
quote-unquote
with the
little black boy on the block
of course, we were just in the middle of the presentation done by Professor Rosemary Bell Antwine, whose focus is cannabis important gains, future prospects. Unfortunately, we're going to have to cut this broadcast short,
and we know
as we have to facilitate coverage of another broadcast at this time. Of course, you can join us here at the UE Open Campus for continued coverage of the symposium. You can come in and make your presence known. Of course, you will be able to ask any questions that you need clarification on, and of course get more information on cannabis and the future commercialization of that product. Of course, on behalf of myself, Hazari Anironi Williams, and our techs on scene, we're taking you back to Studio 1 DBS Master Control.
Conscience, stroke religion, privacy, and so on. So very important precedents that Dominica must pay attention to, because of course our constitutions are very similar to Jamaica. And I think also we've seen across the region the benefits and the lessons learned. We now know that there's no floodgates. Prof. Abel did some studies and it showed the use, once you made changes in law, didn't really change. It's not as though everybody ran out and started to become addicts. And of course, the whole addiction thing is also suspect as well. It has been disproven. So we know that that is not the issue, that is no reason to prevent law reform all the way. I've already mentioned the proceeds of crime and anti-money laundering in terms of future prospects. If we are serious about building an industry, we can't be building an industry around a substance that is still inherently deemed illegal. We, I think, need to band together. CARICOM needs to have a unified front in fighting the remaining international treaty restrictions. At the same time, I personally have always said I didn't see them as a great obstruction, that we are still rather timid, especially since Canada has basically said, well, we don't really care about international treaties, Uruguay, etc. And as Rose mentioned, some of the states in the United States. So we also have a precedent in terms of not adhering to some of the international conventions. And as any student will tell you, international treaty and international agreements are only as good as consensus. So if there's no consensus in the international community, then really and truly they are not worth anything, which is where we are at the moment. There's very little consensus about these, especially the classification of cannabis as a dangerous drug without any benefit. So I don't think Jamaica has been having the right approach of doing this unilaterally. We have failed so far to try to get CARICOM to act in a unified front, to go to these meetings. I went to one about 3 years ago in Vienna to try to have a voice to lobby against these treaties, but that is something that needs to be done in terms of CARICOM. In industry and trade, I am very concerned about the approach that we have taken. When I was in Dominica last time, I recall a young person talking about the benefits in relation to soil health when you plant cannabis with other crops. That's the kinds of things you have to do in terms of trade and industry. There are considerable benefits to be had, but I believe it's the innovations that will help us, not so much the raw material, that is some of it too, but all of the innovative products and ways in which we can use cannabis. Certainly also there will be savings in relation to where we don't have all these law enforcement issues and a reduced black market. Savings from pharmaceuticals, which are very expensive, if we can use cannabis instead, although quite frankly, right now, cannabis is very expensive, but that's another story. But the positive benefits is sales, very importantly, the licensing arrangements, which have so far been quite inequitable. Those who have gotten to that point, Jamaica has, St. Vincent has, simply because it's all tied up with big business, which is something we are very, very concerned about. That here we are creating a cannabis industry, generally to do with medical cannabis, which can create innovative enterprise, which can provide employment, encourage entrepreneurship, which young people are very interested in. But so far, what we have done is to leave it in the hands of foreign companies. And so we need to change that. We need to change that, make it much more inclusive, in particular for the indigenous farmers who they're all along, and it's a bit of a conundrum, it's a bit of an irony, that they were the ones lobbying for the change, and now that we have going towards a legal regime, they are shut out of the market. So we need to protect our hegemony. We need to reconcile these tensions between small local farmers and foreign large enterprises going forward for the future prospects to bear fruit. And the legal reforms and other social reforms have to make way in this. So this is where I think we are at now. This is where we are at. Of course, that includes the medical research from the Dr. Emanuels and others, research leaders, emphasizing human rights and cannabis as a controlled substance, not a dangerous drug, within a developmental perspective. And certainly, I believe there's still a lot of potential. We can still exhale. The report is labeled waiting to exhale. If we are able to address some of the imbalances that the industry is now going up with. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and hopefully you have a couple of questions that I can answer. Hello? Hello?
Can you hear me, Professor?
We've been hearing you loud and clear.
While you were waiting, I think you made us a very good presentation. Thank you very much. I think you made a subtle distinction between regulation versus not legalizing. I didn't quite get you on that. You know, we can regulate the industry.
Yeah, so we regulate, thank you, we regulate alcohol, for instance, we regulate tobacco, but they are not inherently unlawful or illegal. So for alcohol, for instance, you have to have a license to sell it. You cannot sell it in a retail way to young people, etc. Tobacco is also
at this time, we've come to the end of DBS's coverage of the Cannabis Symposium, from traditional cultivation to the commercialization of cannabis, of course hosted by the Rastafari Ainati Waitukubuli Multi-Purpose Cooperative Societies Limited through the House of Nyabinghi Waitukubuli and the UE Open Campus Dominica. We heard from Dr. Marshall Emanuel, focused traditional cultivation to commercialization of cannabis sativa. We also heard from Ms. Roseanne Charles, focus the existing legal framework and recommendations and amendments to be made for the legalization of cannabis in Dominica. And the final individual you just heard from was Professor Rosemary Bell Antwine. Her focus was on cannabis, important gains, future prospects, and there are quite a few speakers still left to speak at this morning's symposium, but unfortunately we're going to cut our coverage of this morning's symposium at this time. Would like to encourage our listeners, if you have the time, to make your way down to the UE Auditorium and, of course, to take part, make your contribution as we discuss cannabis from traditional cultivation to commercialization of cannabis. The name is Azari Anironi Williams. Until next time, stay well.